Hey guys, Drifter here. Welcome to my review of the Battlefield 2042 beta. I was lucky enough to get to play early for about 4 hours, and the short version of this review is it's looking good. Like, really good. You've seen some good gameplay clips here in the beginning, and I've got a lot more to show throughout the course of this video. We're going to be talking everything about the beta, from the good, the bad, to the ugly, to the technical, like the graphics and performance on your card, which is the perfect segue into today's sponsor, which is Nvidia. And that's the perfect sponsor for this video because the game is gorgeous. Nvidia not only makes great hardware, but also great software features to back it up. So if you have an Nvidia GPU, 900 series or up, one of the features that I would encourage you enabling on Battlefield 2042 is Nvidia Reflex. The short version of this is that it lowers your render latency, thus lowering your system latency a little bit, and making your game feel a little bit more responsive, a little bit more snappy, and can sometimes actually help mitigate peakers' advantage too. Nvidia Reflex is very easy to enable. From the main menu, just click on Options, where you would change your, well, everything. Go to Display, which is the second tab over, then scroll down to the very bottom, and you'll see Nvidia Reflex Low Latency, and go ahead and enable that. That'll reduce your system latency and increase your PC's responsiveness, as you can see in the tab over here on the right. And just as a general pro tip, I like to turn my motion blur down. I like it looking crisp as well, so we're gonna go ahead and do that. And I'll spare you the math on how all of this works and just direct you toward a link down there in the description. There's a link below you can click on that'll take you to Nvidia's page, where you can learn anything and everything you want to know about Reflex and Nvidia DLSS, which we'll talk about in a moment. Reflex is a feature that I turn on in every single PC game that supports it. It's supported by any 900 series and up cards, so basically any card that runs Battlefield, and you don't need a G-Sync monitor to use it. You get the most benefit out of this option in a GPU bottleneck scenario, and let me tell you, Battlefield 2042 is demanding, so a lot of you are going to be running into GPU bottlenecks. Nvidia DLSS wasn't available in our early beta today, but will be supported in the full game. That'll save you some GPU resources too, so when the full game comes out, we'll talk about that. But seriously, check out Nvidia. They're great. Basically, all of the gameplay that you see today was captured on Nvidia Shadowplay. I linked them down there in the description, so give it a click, give it a read, and now let's get back to our review. The shortest possible version of this review is that Battlefield 2042 is looking really good right now, but let's go ahead and start off with the good things first. I think the graphics for this game are nothing short of astounding, and they have good aesthetics as well. Every single technical detail about the graphics, from the water to the smoke to the fog to the mud, reflection, rain effects, destruction, fire, particles, general scale of rendering and everything is just downright fantastic. But what really makes it shine is that the game has nice, crisp, clean aesthetics. It's a lot like Battlefield 4 in that, yes, there's a lot happening, yes, things are blowing up or on fire, but the particles and effects aren't overwhelming. You kind of don't get lost in the fog of the gameplay, so to speak, and you can always tell what's going on. It's got a great color palette, it's got great lighting in most scenarios. Even inside, where it's supposed to be darker, you can still see your enemies and interact and fight. And pretty much everything about it just sort of makes sense, as if the team knew what kind of artistic look they were going for and they implemented it, and then they added a giant storm, which is just, broadly speaking, incredibly fun. I like parachuting in it, and I like flying around in it. It looks great. I think most of the content creators just wanted to like fly around the storm and film it in this particular segment. But the other thing that's good about Battlefield 2042 is its base gameplay, and that is the most important part of any video game. Battlefield 2042 knew what kind of game it wanted to be, or the devs knew what kind they wanted to make, and they made that game. So think about it as let's think if you start of a base of a game of being about like Battlefield 4, and then they decided to undo a lot of the shooting mechanics that Battlefield 4 had, import a lot of the ones from Battlefield 5, and maybe even increase those to make a very tight CoD-like shooter. The weapons are, for the most part, quite accurate when you aim down sights. They do have Battlefield mechanics of inaccuracy as the full auto continues, and bullet drop in range and all of that, but they're much more forgiving in this game than they have been in really any Battlefield title that I've ever played. Bullet velocity is quite high for the majority of the speed of the bullet. For assault rifles, you really won't have to worry about your velocity too much unless you're shooting fleas on a hill at a distance. Time to kill is relatively fast. Not many weapons are going to be bullet sponges, though I do admit if you try to use SMGs at extreme ranges, even if you are very accurate, it's not going to deal very much damage and you'll have a slow time time to kill. Headshots deal a ton of extra damage, so the game very much so rewards headshots, which is a good thing. And the recoil is lower than what you would have to deal with in most Battlefield games, or more specifically, the visual recoil and the amount that it kicks up and you have to pull down is pretty reasonable. But Battlefield games have traditionally added a lot of inaccuracy the longer you fire, just inaccuracy that you can't see or control, like Counter-Strike. This game has a lot less of that. So for the most part, your bullets are going to go wherever you put those crosshairs, and it makes the shooting feel really, really crisp. I think that the hot swapping attachments on the fly feature is really cool. Every gun that you equip has a couple of different attachments that you can cycle through. Typically, no attachments means faster and snappier. More attachments means slower, but you get some kind of performance benefit. SMGs have suppressors, rifles have compensators, like LMGs and stuff have long barrels. Of course, there are all sorts of lasers and grips and optical attachments, but it takes only a second or two to swap them. So if you're in an outdoor engagement and you're popping people with this long-range zoom scope, and then you need to move in and push a building, you can swap to iron sights or red dot sight or laser or whatever it is that you happen to need. I personally enjoyed it, and I think that the overall pace of the gameplay is a little bit faster than the other Battlefield games. I noticed that they added a very CoD-like, or more since it's EA, Apex-like sliding mechanic. So if you hit crouch and slide down the hill, it'll feel very familiar to Apex, and you can shoot and move and do everything while you're doing that as well. Like Apex and CoD, there's now lots of zip lines on the map. Since the maps have extreme verticality, they have a lot of ways to get on top of the building. Vertical zip lines, very long zip lines that take you to the top of a radar tower and then over to the rocket launch or something like that. And you can combine this with the grapple hook, with your ability to mantle, to climb, to run fast, jump pretty high, and you've got way more mobility in this Battlefield game than you do in any of them that I have ever played. And since I'm a guy that likes speed and movement, all that, I absolutely loved it. Battlefield 2042's building destruction is the most similar to Battlefield 4. I think a lot of you were really hoping for Bad Company, where you can punch individual sized holes in buildings and level floors and then take the entire thing down like Tower 7. But that is not true. The destruction is very much so like Battlefield 4 in that you have your big scale destruction like the storm or the rocket launch blowing up, or a couple of buttons you can hit that do things on the map like activate the cryogenics chamber and freeze people. And then a lot of smaller scale destruction, which is windows, combustible barrels, and tanks, cars. And you can punch holes in buildings, but for the most part you can't take down the frame of the building itself. You just make it more porous, and it's not easy or always tactically advantageous to do so. I think that's generally the best compromise between total destruction and levelution only. It's kind of in a nice sweet spot, so I'm totally okay with that. Battlefield 2042 has a huge scale of combat. These maps are massive, no doubt. Well, the one map I got to play, Orbital, was massive. It would be one of the bigger maps in any other Battlefield game, but as I'm told, it's a medium map in this game. Now, that's not always good, but it is at the very least technically impressive and very cool to look at. Speaking of looking at things, the HUD and overall player feedback, I want to use the word telemetry, but signaling what's going on is very good. That's kind of like the aesthetics of the game. The HUD tells you every single thing that you need to know without wasting a whole lot of space, and it more or less matches the theme of the game and doesn't cover up important areas. And not only does the HUD in good situation, but if you're drowning, if you're on fire, if you're taking damage in the storm, or a lightning strike, which can disable your HUD actually since it's a digital thing, since you're wearing like goggles, like the HUD is your soldier's goggles, which is kind of cool. But there's other things in the game that let you know if you've taken damage from an enemy and where they're from, or it's from a lightning strike or the water, or a ton of different stuff. Good footsteps, good audio. There's a lot of information that I can pull from the environment that's helpful to me, and that's just another sign of good design. I love that the specialists that they brought back are basically unlocked and mix and match. So you will pick a specialist that has two abilities, typically one unique gadget and a perk. For example, you're mostly seeing me play the assault guy, and his unique gadget is the grapple hook, and his perk is that he can strafe faster while aiming down sights, and he can shoot more accurately on the zip lines while aiming down sights than the other classes. So you can pick that, but then you can have any weapon on this guy that you want. I can have a sniper rifle and run around with these assault abilities. I can do a shotgun, a pistol, a DMR, LMG, all of that's unlocked. And I can also choose whatever equipment that it is that I want, whatever grenades, whatever rockets, whatever bonus abilities. So you can make a sniper guy who has the ability to detect enemies that are nearby so he can't get snuck up on, and load out an SMG on him and play very aggressive. You can make him a support guy and run him with, you know, traditional like rocket launcher and stuff, but then you can also run specialty equipment that would be more common for snipers. So the class abilities or class specializations, so the combination of things that you can make with your classes are greater than before, but still controlled in a way to where I don't think it's unfair, except I do admit I was like 90% grapple hook because that was just the most fun thing for me. It's really cool to me that you can spawn in transport vehicles. Like if you just spawn somewhere in the middle of nowhere and you don't want to walk, you know, however many meters, you can hit on the PC at least what is the B button and select one of the vehicles and it'll come and drop it down for you. These aren't going to be like tanks and planes, they'll just be like little ATVs and dune buggies, but it does help you transverse the map faster. The storm, which we already mentioned, is mostly fun. The storm doesn't really kill you unless you stay in the center of it for a very long time. Basically, it comes onto the map and it's a giant like electrical tornado that goes across, and it kind of works like the storm in Fortnite, and when you get close to it, the tornado winds pick you up and start carrying you higher and higher and higher, and you're stuck in it. But when you cut your chute, since it no longer has the chute to latch onto, it flings you really far in whatever direction. So not only does it rain, the lightning strikes disable your HUD, it deals a little damage while you're in it, it chews up buildings that it goes over, but what the storm really is a sort of additional mobility, so that if the storm's in the middle of nowhere, you can jump into it, go up, and get flung halfway across the map and land wherever it is that you want to be. In terms of optimization, the game itself appears to be very stable. The build that I played, I didn't crash, I didn't have very many hiccups. In the very beginning, when I'm still loading the level a little bit, there's definitely little drops and hiccups, but I think that this game, at least the beta that I played, is in a more stable and better functioning condition than any AAA shooter that I've tried since maybe Overwatch. Very, very good from a stability standpoint. We're going to talk about a GPU demand standpoint in the bad section, because it is really demanding, but it's not crashy, it's not buggy, not many gameplay bugs. We ran into a few where you couldn't reload or swap attachments, or I had a little difficulty spawning a vehicle, but for the most part, they were very minor things that didn't really take me out of the game. And the good news is, what DICE told us anyway, is that the beta that we're playing, which is the beta that you're going to play, is over 2 months old. So when the final game comes out, there'll be 3+ months of improvement to whatever you're playing today in terms of bugs and stability and just generally everything. I do think that the grapple hook is nothing short of amazing. That is the absolute perfect thing to add to Battlefield. It makes it a little bit less painful to kick campers off of buildings. It makes the verticality more fun and less punishing, and it generally just allows you to go for insane clips. Battlefield is all about clips and like Battlefield moments and jumping out of a plane to shoot another plane and then back in, but while with a grapple hook, your mobility and therefore ability to get all of these plays goes way up and your counterplay potential is really high. So I think it was super good, probably the best of all the specialists. And one last thing in the good section, the old gen previews that we saw actually looked pretty good. They showed us gameplay from Xbox One and PlayStation 4, and on those systems you can only have 64 players. No, the graphics are not as good as what you're seeing today. We weren't allowed to share them, but honestly they're not that bad looking. I mean, I saw them on a little preview window that was streamed and that kind of stuff, so there's some compression, but what I saw looked very reasonable. It looked similarly stable, but just lacking in a lot of details, and it wasn't, a lot of these like cross-gen games, the old gen like on Cyberpunk or something comes out very potato-like. Not so much here. It was very more representative of the regular game, so I think a lot of you are going to be happy with that. And now it's time to talk about the bad things. The bad things are about half as long as the good, and then the ugly section is going to be really small today. So the number one bad thing is that the game is demanding on GPUs, and that's a little bit of an awkward subject to broach, especially in a video that is sponsored by Nvidia. But the demand is significant. The game looks beautiful, it's stable, it doesn't crash, and I love everything about it, but there's a price to pay for that, and that price is you're gonna need a good GPU to have a great time here. I talked to a lot of people that were playing in the chat with me, a lot of other content creators. Most of them were on 2080 or 2080 Ti still, and with those kind of settings at 1080p, they needed to play on medium. Most of them were playing on medium to maintain a stable above 60, we'll say 70 to 80 FPS on medium settings. Now I'm blessed to have an RTX 3090, which means that my GPU basically can't get any better. And at that, I put all of my settings on ultra, so the graphics you're seeing in all of this gameplay is like ultra maximum, every single thing, 1440p, and I topped out at about 80 FPS, bouncing up and down a little bit. If I wanted 120 FPS, I would have to drop a few settings or drop my resolution. And some of the other content creators that I played with were on 1080 Ti still, and those guys were kind of swapping back and forth between medium and low. So the game looks good and is stable and has a giant scale, but the reality is you're going to need a good GPU if you want to run that on high settings. Now, hitting 1080p 60 is doable on pretty much any modern graphics card, but if you want to crank this one at 4K or 1440, 144 hertz, you're going to need a really big card, which can hurt your wallet, of course. Another bad thing is that, I mentioned this before with the specialist, the grapple hook is better than, well, really everything, in my opinion. The other specialist, one has a sentry turret and a robot dog. The other one, you know, the sniper guy has a drone he can fly around and he can detect when you're coming up. The medic can heal and revive people. But for me, for my money, nothing is more valuable than the grapple hook. That's an instant get out of trouble, instant engage, skip the ladder, jump straight to the top of the building, jump out of a helicopter, hook one thing, throw yourself into a zip line, and then zip onto a building for an ambush. And for me, that's way better than having a little personal radar. Balance-wise, that's probably not a good thing. I think you're going to see a lot of people running grapple hooks and not so much of anything else. And I'm actually going to expand on this a little bit more in the ugly section. Another thing in the bad section is that while I talked about the gameplay being very CoD-like and tight and responsive, which I liked, that also means it's kind of easy. Now, I didn't have this opinion, but I did talk to some of the lifelong Battlefield guys while we were playing, and they were of the opinion that the aiming and shooting mechanics were very easy and very noob-friendly. That might be an elitist point of view, but they felt that there were too few mechanics to master and that everybody was kind of lasering each other. In the case of assault rifles, this may be true. In my personal experience, assault rifles were generally a sort of best at everything class. You could swap to the correct sight and barrel and dink snipers that have this gigantic glare. It's a little bit harder to snipe than it is to just sort of treat your assault rifles like DMRs. The DMRs are harder to use than assault rifles. SMGs do have a faster time to kill. They absolutely rip people up close. You've probably seen a lot of vector gameplay already. But they're pretty horrific at long ranges, whereas assault rifles are still good up close, to be honest, and great at long ranges. So you only get a little bit of benefit there from running the SMG. And I feel like that some of the other weapons are going to need to get a little stronger, or the ARs are going to have to get hit with the balancing hammer just a little bit, because otherwise they're going to be too popular. On the topic of easy and popular, Battlefield 2042 has very easy to fly aircraft. This is very good for accessibility. The controls are also well designed for console. The bad thing is that means they're very difficult to fly on PC. And the aircraft are going to be very powerful when you get good pilots in them, which is one of the most frustrating things about any Battlefield game, is when some guy in a jet and a helicopter just goes like 112 kills and 4 deaths on your team and is basically untouchable when he's max level everything. Now, even though we had some excellent Battlefield players and pilots and stuff in the game, that didn't happen yet, but they're easy enough to use to where that is very possible for the future, and in general, the game is very easy to play. I personally love that. I think that's going to get more people into Battlefield, but the Battlefield people that I played with definitely had their complaints about how easy it was. They said it was kind of like baby's first Battlefield. I do think it's a bad thing that there's no total building destruction with all of the amazing features that we're getting in mechanics and graphics. A part of me really do wishes that bad company destruction would come back to where I could just blow my own custom holes and do all sorts of stuff. So our building destruction is not quite total, and that does break the immersion a little bit. I feel like that could have been done a little bit better, and there's a lot of walking. Yes, you can kill yourself and redeploy. Yes, you can spawn a vehicle, and there's zip lines and grapples, and it's less walking than Battlefield games before. But one of the core parts about Battlefield games is if you think there's going to be a fight somewhere and you spend, a minute running over there, sometimes you get there and there's nothing happening, then you have to run it a minute or two in the other direction. And there is a fair bit of that. The map that we played, Orbital, has a couple of different choke points and key points, and then a lot of empty space in the middle. Now, the empty space in the middle is very interesting for some sort of PUBG-like combat between the trees, but really there's not much going on out there, so you kind of just run back and forth and don't do anything until you get close to the objective. That's kind of a Battlefield standard, but it's definitely not a good thing. And in the bad section, the Storm and the Rocket can be kind of repetitive. Yeah, they're fun, they're big, they're hype, but they do not the same, but similar things almost every time, and you can tell they're coming. And when it happens over and over and over again, it gets a lot less hype. That's the same kind of problem that people had with the BF4 levelution, and I had kind of the same problem here. After like the second or third time the storm was on the map, I was just saying to myself, man, I really wish we had less storm. I think I like the map better when it's all sunny and bright and green, but I guess I have to deal with this storm for like the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. Then finally, at the very end of this video, in the ugly section, there's a couple of things that aren't very great. Number one is that I believe that some of the maps are going to be unplayably large. The massive map that you've seen today called Orbital is considered a medium-sized map. They have bigger maps than this in the final version of the game, but even Orbital felt too big for 128 players. It felt very spread out. There was a lot of people meandering, walking. To be fair, this was a learning session. People weren't playing really hard. They were testing graphics and filming stuff, but it was really big. I think we played at 110 out of 128 players, and it still felt kind of sparse in quite a few occasions. What they don't have is kind of, if you remember playing Battlefield 1, Battlefield 1 was the opposite. Battlefield 1 was hundreds of dudes, tight little clusters, trenches, no man's land, brutal fighting out there, a bunch of godless savages fighting in the sand over the train. This game doesn't have that. It's more like Battlefield 4 where you wander around a whole lot, and I'm really afraid that on the giant maps it's going to be like a ghost town. In the ugly section, we already talked about this a little bit in the bad section, but if the planes are going to be very, very easy, pilots may dominate. Now, any class can take anti-aircraft, and there's a lot of ways to take them down, but there's also a lot of ways to absolutely Shrek people with the airplanes. So I'm really afraid that we might see like a jet and or helicopter dominant game. And then probably the ugliest in the ugly section is, I'm afraid that solo gameplay won't last that long. While I had a great time playing this, and let me tell you, I loved playing this game, I essentially did it solo because we weren't able to squad up and send friend requests because our accounts were restricted and stuff, which meant that I couldn't call for a revive, I couldn't really call for more ammo. There was a lot of things that I kind of could not do, so I found myself just relying on the grapple hook more than anything. And it did get a little bit repetitive. Even though I had a squad, I felt very much so alone because I couldn't really communicate with them. And I did see some squads that somehow all got together and they were communicating and they were covering each other and sharing meds and ammo and doing a lot of complicated stuff, but that was not me. So if you're a solo gamer and you're not playing with friends and you can't communicate with people, or the squad system for really like any reason just doesn't work out the way they think it will, it's gonna kind of get repetitive fast, and that's a bad thing. So I want the game to not be repetitive. I don't want people to get bored of Battlefield and go back to playing any other game. And I think that the key to doing that is to making sure the squad system works. As long as the squad system works and is rewarding for all the different roles, and there's reasons for people to use it instead of just the grapple hook, I think the game's going to be good. But if it ends up being an 80% grapple hook game, then that's going to be rough. And if the devs are watching this, this is not me calling for a grapple hook nerf. Quite the opposite, actually. I love it, and I think it's in a good spot. I just think that there needs to be more of an incentive for squad-based combat, and that a few of the abilities on the other specialists could probably use to be a little bit stronger. Also, don't forget to go to your options and enable Nvidia Reflex, and or click the link down there in the description to learn more about Nvidia Reflex. Well guys, that's all for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.